just witnessed 8 English words delete $4.9 billion in exactly 180 seconds. And those 8 words started with, "Did you really wear that to?" But before I tell you how a Weinstein became a financial earthquake, let me ask you something. Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere? Drop a comment with your city and smash that subscribe button for Black Stories box, because tonight's story will make you believe in instant karma delivery. My name is Isabella Chen, and I'm about to tell you how I watched the most expensive social assassination in corporate history unfold right before my eyes. It happened at the Meridian Foundation Gala, one of those $1,000-a-plate affairs where San Francisco's elite gather to write checks and feel good about themselves. I was there covering the event for Tech Weekly, camera discreetly positioned, notebook ready. The ballroom at the St. For the Faced and Evan Rewan. Regis gleamed like a jewelry box, all crystal chandeliers and gold accents. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos mingled with women whose jewelry could fund small nations. The air buzzed with the particular energy that comes when people with serious money pretend to care about charity while actually networking for their next big deal. That's when I first noticed her. Dr. Maya Washington stood near the silent auction tables, examining a painting with the kind of quiet attention that suggested genuine interest rather than social performance. At 47, she carried herself with the understated confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her amber silk dress was elegant without being flashy expensive, without screaming its price tag. She looked like she belonged, but somehow apart from it all. Maya was the founder and CEO of Titan Dynamics, a tech conglomerate that had revolutionized everything from renewable energy to artificial intelligence. Forbes had her pegged at $3.2 billion, but she was notoriously private, rarely appearing at these kinds of events. When she did, she typically stayed on the periphery, writing her check and leaving early. On the opposite side of the room, commanding attention like a magnet draws iron filings, was Victoria Sterling. At 34, Victoria was everything. Maya wasn't loud, flashy, and desperately hungry for the spotlight. Her red sequined dress caught every light in the room, her laugh carried across conversations, and her presence demanded acknowledgement. As CEO of Sterling Enterprises, she'd built her company through aggressive acquisitions and even more aggressive self-promotion. Victoria had grown up middle class in Ohio, daughter of a mechanic who abandoned the family when she was 16. That abandonment had carved something hollow inside her, a void she tried to fill with power, attention, and the kind of fear-based respect that comes from making people nervous about crossing you. She'd learned early that if you couldn't be loved, being feared was the next best thing. The evening progressed normally enough. Speeches about charitable causes, polite applause, the gentle clink of champagne glasses. I was positioning myself for some candid shots when I noticed Victoria's attention had locked onto Maya like a heat-seeking missile. There was something predatory in the way she watched, as if calculating angles of attack. Maya, seemingly oblivious, continued her quiet circuit of the room. She spoke briefly with a young server who was struggling with a heavy tray, her gesture so natural and kind that it stopped me mid-step. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, probably working this event to pay for college. Maya's intervention was subtle but unmistakably protective. That's when Victoria made her move. She glided across the room with the determined grace of a shark scenting blood, her small entourage trailing behind like pilot fish. The conversations around them began to quiet as people sensed something was about to happen. In rooms like this, drama was rare, and therefore precious when it occurred. "Well, well," Victoria said, her voice carrying just far enough to draw attention without seeming to try. "Look what we have here." She positioned herself directly in Maya's line of sight, blocking the older woman's path to the exit. "Maya Washington, isn't it? I've heard so much about you." Maya's response was measured, polite. "Miss Sterling, thank you for organizing such a lovely event." Her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from years of practice, managing difficult people and impossible situations. But Victoria wasn't done, not even close. She was just getting started, and I could see in her eyes that she had been planning this moment, waiting for it, savoring it before it even began. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as people began to realize they were about to witness something that would be talked about in boardrooms for years to come. The first warning sign was Victoria's smile. It was too wide, too sharp, the kind of expression that parents teach children to recognize as dangerous. She took a step closer to Maya, invading the older woman's personal space in a way that was subtle enough to seem accidental, but deliberate enough to be unmistakably aggressive. You know, Victoria continued, her voice, honey sweet with poison underneath. I was just telling the Hartmans about your company. Such an interesting trajectory you've had. The pause before interesting was loaded with implications, the kind of pregnant silence that makes everyone within earshot lean in slightly. Maya's response was to simply nod, her expression giving away nothing. But I caught something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. She knew exactly what kind of game Victoria was playing, and more importantly, she knew how it was going to end. The room had developed that peculiar stillness that happens when a crowd senses conflict brewing. Conversations continued, but voices were lower, attention split between their own interactions and the drama unfolding near the silent auction tables. I adjusted my position, making sure I had a clear view while trying to remain inconspicuous. Victoria circled Maya like a predator, testing its prey, her sequined dress catching the light with each calculated movement. You know, Maya, I have to ask. She paused, ensuring every nearby ear was tuned to her frequency. Did you really wear that to a Billionaire's gala? The words hit the air like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the string quartet seemed to falter for a moment before recovering their rhythm. Victoria's voice had carried just far enough to ensure maximum audience without seeming intentionally loud. Maya stood perfectly still, her hand resting lightly on her clutch. She didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give Victoria the satisfaction of visible impact. But I was close enough to see the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, the way her breathing became just slightly more controlled. Victoria continued, emboldened by what she interpreted as weakness. Amber silk is so academic. So middle management, don't you think? She gestured vaguely at Maya's dress, which was actually a piece of understated elegance that probably cost more than most people's cars. The crowd was fully engaged now, pretending to examine auction items while straining to catch every word. I noticed several board members from various companies in the immediate vicinity, including Robert Chen from Pacific Investments, who was recording the interaction on his phone with barely concealed glee. Victoria wasn't finished. She was just warming up, and I could see the calculated cruelty building in her expression. Perhaps you misunderstood the dress code. This is a $1,000 a plate charity gala, not a faculty mixer. Her laugh was sharp, designed to cut, though I suppose they look similar from the outside. Several people in Victoria's immediate circle tittered, nervously uncertain whether they were supposed to find this amusing or horrifying. The social calculus was complex. Nobody wanted to offend either woman, but Victoria was clearly the aggressor, and Maya's reputation for quiet competence was well established in their circles. Maya's response was to reach into her clutch with deliberate calm. For a moment I thought she might leave, might take the high road and simply walk away from Victoria's provocation. Instead, she withdrew her phone and placed a call. Ironclad protocol, she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. Authorization Washington, Maya 774. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, unmistakably that of someone used to handling serious business at all hours. Confirmed, Dr. Washington. Deal freeze initiated. Escrow locked. All conditional agreements suspended pending review. Victoria's phone buzzed almost immediately. Then again, and again. Her expression shifted from smug confidence to confused concern as she glanced at the screen. The color began to drain from her face as she read whatever messages were flooding in. Ladies and gentlemen, Maya said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent room, I think there's been a misunderstanding about who exactly doesn't belong here. She turned to face Victoria directly for the first time since the confrontation began. You see, Victoria, you just insulted the person who signs your oxygen bills. The room erupted in whispers as the implications began to sink in. Victoria's Sterling Enterprises was in the middle of a massive merger deal with Titan Dynamics, a $4.9 billion transaction that would have made Victoria one of the most powerful women in tech. The deal had been months in the making, with both sides negotiating complex terms and conditions. But buried deep in those contracts was something called a morals clause, a provision that allowed either party to terminate the agreement if the other party engaged in behavior that could damage the combined company's reputation. Maya had just activated that clause with surgical precision. Victoria's phone continued buzzing insistently. Her board members were calling, her lawyers were texting, her PR team was in crisis mode. The deal she had spent 2 years orchestrating, the transaction that was supposed to cement her legacy and financial security, was evaporating in real time. This can't be happening, Victoria whispered, but her voice carried in the silent room. She looked around desperately as if seeking allies in a crowd that was rapidly distancing itself from her. The same people who had been hanging on her every word minutes earlier were now studying their shoes or suddenly discovering urgent conversations elsewhere. Maya smiled for the first time that evening, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Oh, but it is happening, Victoria. You wanted to know if I belonged here. Well, let me clarify something for you. I don't just belong here. I own here." The revelation hit the room like a tsunami. Maya Washington wasn't just another tech billionaire attending a charity function. She was the foundation's largest single donor, the woman whose contributions had funded half the programs they were celebrating tonight. More than that, her investment firm held significant stakes in many of the companies represented in that very room. Victoria swayed slightly, reaching for a nearby table to steady herself. The full magnitude of her miscalculation was becoming clear, and it was devastating. The aftermath of Maya's revelation spread through the ballroom like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. I watched as the social dynamics shifted in real-time, alliances recalculating power structures, reorganizing themselves around this new information. Victoria stood at the center of it all, isolated and increasingly desperate. "Maya, please," Victoria said, her voice losing its earlier confidence. "This is all just a misunderstanding. Surely we can discuss this privately, work something out." She reached out as if to touch Maya's arm, but the older woman stepped back smoothly, maintaining distance. "A misunderstanding." Maya's voice was dangerously quiet. "You publicly humiliated me based on the color of my skin and the assumption that I didn't belong in your world. That wasn't a misunderstanding, Victoria. That was calculated cruelty." The racial undertones of Victoria's attack were now impossible to ignore. What had been framed as commentary on dress code and social appropriateness was revealed for what it truly was, a display of prejudice wrapped in the veneer of upper-class propriety. The room buzzed with uncomfortable recognition. I noticed Maya's legal counsel, Patricia Rodriguez, making her way through the crowd with the determined stride of someone who had been expecting this call. Patricia was a formidable woman in her 50s, known throughout Silicon Valley for her ability to dismantle corporate opponents with surgical precision. "Dr. Washington," Patricia said quietly as she approached the board, "has been notified. Termination paperwork is prepared and ready for your signature. The morals clause is ironclad, and Sterling Enterprises has no legal recourse." Victoria overheard, and her last vestiges of composure cracked. "You can't do this. 2 years of work, hundreds of jobs, shareholder value. You're destroying everything over hurt feelings." Maya turned to face her fully, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with people like Victoria. "Hurt feelings, Victoria. You just demonstrated to a room full of your peers and investors that you consider racial humiliation an acceptable business practice. You think this is about my feelings." The crowd pressed closer, no longer pretending to browse auction items. This was the kind of corporate drama that would be dissected in business schools for years to come. Camera phones appeared discreetly, though whether to document the moment or protect themselves legally wasn't clear. "Let me explain what's happening here." Maya continued, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "Sterling Enterprises stock will open Monday morning in freefall. Your board will demand your resignation before lunch. The SEC will launch an investigation into your public statements and their potential impact on shareholder value. And every business relationship you've spent years building will evaporate because nobody wants to be associated with someone who thinks public humiliation is acceptable behavior." Victoria's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, anger, and growing panic. "This is insane. You're destroying both our companies over nothing." "Over nothing." Maya's voice rose slightly for the first time that evening. "Victoria, let me tell you about nothing. Nothing is what I felt when I was 22 years old, and a security guard at the Four Seasons told me I didn't belong at a tech conference because I didn't look like the other attendees. Nothing is what I felt when venture capitalists questioned whether a black woman could handle the pressure of running a major company. Nothing is what I felt when board members suggested I might be more comfortable in a supporting role." The room was completely silent now, every person present understanding they were witnessing something that transcended business into the realm of social justice and historical reckoning. "You want to know what nothing feels like, Victoria? It feels like being told that no matter how hard you work, how much you achieve, how much wealth you accumulate, there will always be someone like you, ready to remind you that you don't belong, that your success is temporary, conditional, subject to their approval." Maya's voice gained strength with each word, decades of suppressed dignity and carefully controlled rage finally finding expression. "Well, I have news for you. and everyone else who thinks they can treat people like me as less than equal. Those days are over. The bill has come due, and the price is exactly $4.9 billion. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Maya, I apologize. I was wrong, completely wrong. Please, let's step aside and discuss this rationally. The deal can still work. We can make this right." But Maya was already shaking her head. "Victoria, the deal was never about the money. It was about respect. And respect isn't something you can negotiate for after you've proven you don't understand its value." She turned to Patricia, who had been waiting patiently with documents already prepared. "Execute the termination. Full stop. Non-negotiable." Victoria's phone erupted with calls as news of the deal's collapse began spreading through financial networks. Her PR team, her lawyers, her board members, all simultaneously demanding explanations for a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with analysis and speculation. Some expressed admiration for Maya's decisive action, others wondered if the response was proportional to the offense. But everyone understood they had witnessed a fundamental shift in how these kinds of incidents would be handled going forward. Victoria stood alone in the center of the ballroom, her sequin dress now seeming garish under the chandeliers, her earlier confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had just lost everything they had worked for. The fallout from Maya's decision rippled outward like a corporate tsunami, and I found myself in the unique position of documenting one of the most expensive social justice moments in business history. Victoria's attempts to contain the damage were increasingly frantic and correspondingly unsuccessful. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media, financial news networks, and tech industry blogs. The hashtag number #RespectIsNotNegotiable began trending worldwide, while number Gatecrash attempted to frame Maya as an oversensitive intruder. But the video footage from the event, discreetly recorded by several attendees, made Victoria's behavior impossible to defend. Monday morning brought a bloodbath for Sterling Enterprises. The stock opened down 37%, wiping out billions in market value before trading was temporarily halted. CNBC ran the story as their lead, with financial analysts struggling to quantify the cost of what they were calling the most expensive dinner party comment in corporate history. Victoria's board called an emergency meeting, and by Tuesday afternoon she was out. The announcement came with carefully worded statements about new strategic direction and leadership transition, but everyone understood what had happened. Victoria Sterling had been fired for racism, and corporate America was taking notes. The legal ramifications proved even more devastating than the financial ones. The SEC launched an investigation into whether Victoria's public statements constituted market manipulation, while the Department of Justice opened a broader inquiry into workplace discrimination at Sterling Enterprises. Employee complaints that had been quietly settled or ignored for years suddenly found their way to federal investigators. But perhaps most damaging of all was the social ostracism. Victoria found herself completely shut out of the networks that had once embraced her. Speaking engagements were canceled, board appointments disappeared, and former allies distanced themselves with speed that would have been comical if it weren't so devastating. I interviewed several people who had witnessed the gala incident, and their accounts painted a picture of someone who had systematically used humiliation and intimidation as business tools. Victoria's behavior toward Maya wasn't an aberration. It was a pattern that had finally encountered someone with the power to stop it. She built her entire reputation on making people feel small, one former Sterling Enterprises executive told me, on condition of anonymity. The problem was, she finally tried it on someone bigger than she was. Maya, meanwhile, handled the aftermath with the same measured precision she had brought to the confrontation itself. She held a single press conference, choosing her words carefully and refusing to be drawn into inflammatory rhetoric. This was never about punishment, she told the assembled media. This was about accountability. For too long, we've accepted that certain behaviors are just part of doing business, that women, particularly women of color, should simply endure humiliation and discrimination as the cost of participating in corporate America. I reject that premise entirely. She announced the establishment of the Respect Initiative, a $50 million foundation dedicated to supporting women and minorities in business, funding legal challenges to discriminatory practices, and providing resources for victims of workplace harassment. The money came from what would have been her profit from the Sterling merger, Some people have suggested that my response was disproportionate, Maya continued. That $4.9 billion is too high a price for a few offensive comments. To those people I would ask, what is the appropriate price for human dignity? What is the acceptable cost of allowing racism to flourish in our boardrooms and our businesses? The press conference was masterful theater, but more than that, it was a clear statement of principles. Maya wasn't backing down, wasn't apologizing, wasn't allowing the narrative to be reframed as corporate overreach or emotional overreaction. Victoria, by contrast, seemed to shrink with each passing day. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation through carefully crafted apologies and strategic charity work fell flat. The business world had moved on, and there wasn't room for her in the new landscape she had inadvertently helped create. I managed to catch up with her outside her former office building as she cleared out her personal items. She looked haggard, older, worn down by the constant pressure and public scrutiny. When I asked if she had anything to say about the events that had destroyed her career, her response was telling. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said quietly. "I was just, I don't know, trying to be funny, trying to fit in. I grew up feeling like I never belonged anywhere, and I guess I thought if I could make someone else feel that way, it would prove that I did belong." It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said since the gala, and it revealed the psychological damage that had driven her behavior. But honesty, while admirable, couldn't undo the consequences of her actions. The Sterling Enterprises board, now led by interim CEO David Park, announced a comprehensive cultural audit and implemented new policies designed to prevent future incidents. They hired Maya's consulting firm to oversee the process, a move that was both strategically smart and symbolically powerful. Dr. Washington didn't just punish bad behavior, Park explained during our interview. She showed us a better way forward. The question now is whether we're smart enough to follow her lead. The broader tech industry was indeed following that lead. Companies across Silicon Valley began reviewing their own policies, examining their cultures, and asking difficult questions about how discrimination and harassment had been normalized in their organizations. Maya had accomplished something remarkable. She had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change. The $4.9 billion price tag wasn't just the cost of Victoria's racism. It was an investment in a more equitable future. 3 months after the gala incident, I sat across from Maya Washington in her corner office overlooking San Francisco Bay. The view was spectacular, but it was clear that her attention was focused inward on the complex work of rebuilding an industry's culture one policy at a time. "Do you ever wonder if you went too far?" I asked, referring to the question that had been circulating in business circles since the story broke. Maya considered the question carefully before responding. "Isabella, let me ask you something. If someone stole $4.9 billion from a corporation, what would happen to them?" "They'd go to prison for the rest of their lives," I answered without hesitation. "Exactly. But when someone steals dignity, when they steal the fundamental right to be treated as an equal human being, we're supposed to forgive and forget. We're supposed to consider the impact on their career, their family, their feelings." She shook her head. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that allowed these behaviors to flourish for so long." The Respect Initiative had already begun making waves across the corporate landscape. In just 3 months, they had funded 17 legal challenges to discriminatory practices, provided support to 43 women and minorities facing workplace harassment, and partnered with 12 major corporations to overhaul their diversity and inclusion programs. "The goal isn't revenge," Maya explained. "It's prevention. We're creating a world where the Victoria Sterlings of tomorrow know that their behavior will have real, immediate, and devastating consequences. Because right now the cost-benefit analysis is all wrong. The benefits of discrimination and harassment far outweigh the risks for most people in positions of power." She was right, of course. For decades, the corporate world had operated on the assumption that certain behaviors, while unpleasant, were simply part of the business landscape. Settlements were reached quietly, NDAs were signed, and life moved on. The victims absorbed the cost while the perpetrators continued climbing corporate ladders. "Victoria Sterling destroyed her own career," Maya continued. "I simply stopped protecting her from the consequences of her choices. The real question isn't whether I went too far. The real question is why it took so long for someone to go far enough." The phone calls and messages had been overwhelming, Maya told me. Women and men from across the country sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination, thanking her for taking a stand, expressing solidarity and support. But there had also been pushback criticism from those who viewed her actions as vindictive or excessive. "Some people think I should have handled it differently," she acknowledged. "They think I should have pulled Victoria aside, had a quiet conversation, given her a chance to apologize privately. But that's exactly how these systems perpetuate themselves. Privacy protects the perpetrator, not the victim. Public accountability is the only thing that creates real change." The interview was interrupted by a knock on the door. Maya's assistant entered with a young woman I recognized as Jennifer Park, a software engineer who had recently won a significant settlement against her former employer for gender discrimination. "Dr. Washington," Jennifer said, "I wanted to thank you personally. Your example gave me the courage to speak up about what was happening at my company. I know it couldn't have been easy to put yourself in the spotlight like that." Maya stood and embraced the younger woman. "Jennifer, you did the hard work. You spoke truth to power when it wasn't convenient or comfortable. That takes real courage." After Jennifer left, Maya was quiet for a long moment. "You know, Isabella, I think about Victoria sometimes. I wonder if she understands what really happened that night. I wonder if she realizes that I didn't destroy her career. Her racism destroyed her career. I just refused to pretend it didn't matter." The broader implications of the incident continued to unfold across the business world. 3 CEOs had resigned in the wake of discrimination scandals that might have been quietly managed in the past. 2 major corporations had settled class action lawsuits rather than face the kind of public accountability Maya had demonstrated. The entire landscape of corporate behavior was shifting. The interesting thing, Maya mused, is that this was never really about Victoria. She was just the person who happened to be standing there when I decided I was done accepting unacceptable behavior. It could have been anyone at any event in any industry. The principles are the same. I asked her about the personal cost of taking such a public stand. Maya had received death threats, faced online harassment, and endured intense scrutiny of every aspect of her life and business practices. "Of course, it's been difficult," she admitted. "But you know what's more difficult? Watching talented people leave industries they love because they can't tolerate the discrimination. Seeing brilliant minds waste their potential because they're constantly having to prove they belong in rooms where they're the only person who looks like them. That's the real tragedy here." As our interview concluded, I reflected on the broader significance of what I had witnessed. The Meridian Foundation Gala had become a watershed moment, a before and after point in how corporate America dealt with discrimination and harassment. Maya Washington had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a masterclass in strategic accountability. "One last question," I said, as we prepared to wrap up. "What would you say to someone who finds themselves in a similar situation, someone who faces discrimination but doesn't have your resources or platform?" Maya's response was immediate and passionate. "Document everything. Build alliances, find your advocates, and remember that dignity is not negotiable regardless of the price someone else tries to put on it. The world is changing slowly but surely, and every person who refuses to accept unacceptable behavior moves us closer to the world we want to live in." 6 months after the gala, the reverberations were still being felt across corporate America. I had continued following the story, tracking its impact on everything from hiring practices to board compositions to the way discrimination complaints were handled. What I found was a fundamental shift in how power operated in business settings. Victoria Sterling had vanished from public life entirely. After her termination from Sterling Enterprises, she had attempted a brief comeback through a series of interview apologies and philanthropic gestures. But the business world had moved on without her. Her attempts to start a consulting firm had failed her, speaking engagements had dried up, and her former allies treated her as toxic waste. I managed to track her down to a small town in Oregon where she was reportedly working at her brother's construction company. She declined my request for an interview, but her brother was willing to talk. "Victoria's been through hell," he told me, over coffee at a local diner. "She knows she screwed up, knows she hurt people, but the punishment. It seems like it'll never end. She lost everything: her career, her reputation, her financial security." Sometimes I wonder if the response was proportional to what she actually did. It was a perspective I heard echoed in certain circles, particularly among those who worried about what they saw as the growing power of cancel culture to destroy lives over single incidents. But when I presented this viewpoint to Maya during a follow-up conversation, her response was characteristically measured. "Victoria's brother is talking about proportionality," Maya said. "But let's examine that concept carefully. For decades, the cost of workplace discrimination was borne entirely by the victims. Women left careers, they loved talented people, changed industries, brilliant minds were wasted because the price of speaking up was higher than the price of staying silent. Where was the concern about proportionality then? The data supported Maya's argument. The Respect Initiative had commissioned a comprehensive study of workplace discrimination costs, and the numbers were staggering. Billions of dollars in lost productivity, talent flight, legal settlements, and institutional damage, all because organizations had chosen to tolerate discriminatory behavior rather than address it systematically. Victoria Sterling made a choice, Maya continued. She chose to publicly humiliate someone based on race and class assumptions. She chose to do it in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom had cameras. She chose to do it to someone with the resources and platform to respond. Those were her choices, and choices have consequences. The Respect Initiative itself had grown into something far larger than anyone had initially envisioned. With partnerships across Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and corporate America, it had become a clearinghouse for discrimination complaints, a training resource for organizations wanting to improve their cultures, and a legal support network for victims of workplace harassment. Jennifer Park, the young engineer I had met in Maya's office, was now working for the initiative as a program coordinator. When I interviewed her about her experience, she painted a picture of an organization that was methodically changing the landscape of corporate accountability. Dr. Washington didn't just get revenge on one racist CEO, Jennifer explained. She created a system where that kind of behavior becomes impossible to sustain. The cost-benefit analysis has completely flipped. Used to be the risk of speaking up was higher than the risk of staying silent. Now it's the opposite. The initiative's approach was sophisticated and multifaceted. They provided legal support for discrimination cases, but they also worked proactively with companies to prevent problems before they occurred. They had developed training programs, policy templates, and cultural assessment tools that were being adopted across industries. We're not trying to destroy careers, Jennifer continued. We're trying to create environments where careers can't be destroyed by discrimination in the first place. The Victoria Sterling case was a catalyst, but the real work is in building systems that make those kinds of incidents impossible. The broader cultural impact was perhaps even more significant than the corporate changes. The phrase "respect is not negotiable" had entered common usage, appearing on everything from social media profiles to protest signs to corporate mission statements. The incident had crystallized something that many people had been feeling but couldn't articulate: that the old ways of handling discrimination were no longer acceptable. I interviewed dozens of women and minorities in various industries who told similar stories about how the Sterling case had changed their approach to workplace conflicts. They were speaking up more quickly, documenting incidents more carefully, and demanding accountability more forcefully. It's like Dr. Washington gave us permission to value ourselves, one pharmaceutical researcher told me. For so long we were trained to absorb disrespect, to smooth over conflicts, to protect other people's comfort at the expense of our own dignity. But watching her refuse to do that, watching her demand real consequences for real harm, it changed how I think about my own worth. The legal profession had taken particular notice of the Sterling case, with discrimination attorneys reporting a significant increase in clients willing to pursue formal complaints rather than accept quiet settlements. The threat of going full Washington, as it had come to be known, was changing how organizations approached these situations. But perhaps the most telling indicator of the case's impact was how rare such incidents had become. Corporate events were now characterized by heightened awareness of behavior that might have been overlooked or excused in the past. The fear of becoming the next Victoria Sterling was a powerful motivator for better behavior. As I reflected on the story's trajectory, I realized that Maya Washington had accomplished something remarkable. She had weaponized consequences. For too long, discrimination had been a low-risk, high-reward behavior for those in positions of power. Maya had flipped that equation, making it high-risk and potentially career-ending. The $4.9 billion price tag was no longer seen as excessive. It was seen as precedent-setting. It established that dignity had real monetary value and that violating it carried real costs. In the calculus of corporate behavior, respect had become a bottom-line issue. 1 year after the Meridian Foundation Gala, I found myself back in the same ballroom for the organization's annual follow-up event. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Where the previous year's gathering had been characterized by the careless confidence of unchecked privilege, this year's attendees moved with the careful consideration of people who understood they were being watched and judged. Maya Washington was once again in attendance, but this time she was the keynote speaker rather than a peripheral figure. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The woman who had been humiliated and dismissed in this very room was now commanding its complete attention and respect. A year ago, Maya began her speech. Someone in this room told me I didn't belong here. Tonight I want to talk about what belonging really means, and who gets to decide where any of us fit in the world. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Many of the same people who had witnessed Victoria's attack were present, and their discomfort was visible. They were confronting their own complicity in a system that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchallenged. Belonging isn't about wearing the right clothes or saying the right things or having the right background, Maya continued. Belonging is about being treated with fundamental human dignity, regardless of what you look like or where you come from. And when that dignity is violated, when belonging is denied based on prejudice and assumption, the cost should be immediate and devastating. The speech was a masterclass in controlled power, each word chosen for maximum impact. Maya spoke about the broader implications of the Sterling case, about the cultural shifts that had followed, about the responsibility that came with privilege and platform. Some people have criticized the consequences that followed Victoria Sterling's behavior, she said. They've suggested that losing a career over a few offensive comments was disproportionate. To those people, I would ask, what is the appropriate consequence for racist humiliation? What is the acceptable price for denying someone's humanity? She paused, letting the questions hang in the air. Because for too long, the answer has been nothing. The price has been nothing. The consequence has been nothing. And nothing is exactly what allowed these behaviors to become normalized in our institutions. The audience shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in her description. These were people who had witnessed discrimination, who had stayed silent during inappropriate comments, who had chosen comfort over courage when confronted with moments that demanded moral clarity. But change is possible, Maya continued, her tone becoming more hopeful. This year, the Respect Initiative has supported over 200 individuals facing workplace discrimination. We've partnered with 93 organizations to improve their cultures. We've seen 3 major legislative changes that strengthen protections for victims of harassment. And most importantly, we've created a new understanding of what accountability looks like. The statistics were impressive, but the human stories were even more powerful. Maya introduced several individuals who had been supported by the initiative, people who had found the courage to speak up about discrimination and harassment because they knew they wouldn't face consequences alone. Dr. Washington's example showed me that dignity is worth fighting for, said Maria Rodriguez, a former aerospace engineer who had successfully challenged systemic discrimination at her company. She demonstrated that we don't have to accept unacceptable behavior just because it's always been acceptable in the past. As the evening progressed, I reflected on the transformation I had witnessed. The Sterling case had become more than just a story about one woman's racism and another woman's response. It had become a parable about power, accountability, and the price of change. Victoria Sterling's name was never mentioned during the evening, but her absence was felt throughout the room. She had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when privilege collided with accountability. Her career had been the sacrifice that allowed this new understanding to emerge. After the formal program ended, I had a final conversation with Maya. She seemed tired but satisfied, carrying the weight of leadership that came with being a symbol of resistance and change. "Do you think Victoria learned anything from what happened?" I asked. Maya considered the question carefully. "I hope so. I genuinely hope that somewhere in Oregon, Victoria Sterling is building a construction company that treats every worker with dignity and respect. I hope she's using her experience to become a better person rather than just a more careful one." It was a generous response, showing a level of empathy that Victoria herself had been incapable of demonstrating. Maya had chosen to focus on systemic change rather than personal revenge, and that choice had made all the difference in how the story was received and remembered. The goal was never to destroy Victoria, Maya continued. The goal was to save the next person who might face what I faced. To create a world where respect truly is non-negotiable, where dignity has real value, where belonging can't be denied based on prejudice and assumption. As our conversation concluded, Maya asked me a question that had been weighing on her mind. Do you think we've gone far enough, Isabella? Or should we have acted sooner, been more forceful, demanded more comprehensive change? It was the same question I had been grappling with throughout my coverage of the story. The Sterling case had created significant change, but it had also required enormous personal cost and public confrontation. Was there a better way to achieve justice? Could systemic change happen without individual sacrifice? I think I told her that you did exactly what needed to be done at exactly the right moment. Sometimes change requires someone to draw a line and say no more. You drew that line, and the world is better for it. Maya smiled, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely at peace with her choices and their consequences. The bill came due, she said simply. $4.9 billion for decades of accepted discrimination. When you think about it that way, it was actually quite a bargain. As I left the gala that night, I realized that I had witnessed something historic, the moment when the cost of discrimination finally exceeded its benefits, when accountability became more powerful than privilege, when respect truly became non-negotiable. The Victoria Sterling case would be studied in business schools and law schools for generations to come, not just as an example of corporate consequences, but as a masterclass in strategic justice. Maya Washington had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for change, and in doing so, she had rewritten the rules of how power operates in American business. The 8 words that started it all, "Did you really wear that to AT?" had indeed erased $4.9 billion. But more than that, they had erased the assumption that discrimination was an acceptable cost of doing business, and that perhaps was priceless. Now, I want to ask you, do you think Maya went too far, or should she have acted sooner? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between keeping the peace and demanding respect? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Box for more stories about courage, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right.